You can hear that gunfire in the distance. The Israelis are trying to engage anyone who tries to ambush their forces. And the battle is street by street. It is urban guerrilla warfare as Hamas is popping out of tunnels and ambushing Israeli troops.
Split-second decisions often mean the difference between life and death for journalists reporting from war zones. Fox News Channel chief foreign correspondent Trey Yingst made such a decision while covering the barbaric Hamas attack on innocent Israelis on October 7th, 2023. A decision he says saved his own life and that of his production crew. Trey shares his personal accounts of covering the Hamas attack, the war in Gaza, and his experience of being a war correspondent in hotspots around the globe in his new book, Black Saturday, an unfiltered account of the October 7th attack on Israel and the war in Gaza.
Right now, the Israelis are engaged in a gun battle with Hamas militants inside the Gaza Strip. They are working at this hour to go block by block and clear this area.
Trey joined Fox News in August 2018, often reporting from Ukraine, Syria, Gaza, Israel, and other locations in the Middle East. When there's news in the region, Trey Yingst is there. Today, he's on the ground in Tel Aviv, where he joins us now. Welcome, Trey.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, you've been a foreign correspondent and journalist since you were in college. So that we have a better understanding, Trey, of that role, how do you define what exactly a chief correspondent is, and what does a chief correspondent do?
Great question. And I think that our role is broadly to go to the places that other people won't go and to tell the stories that otherwise wouldn't be told. I've been doing this for a long time now, more than a decade, and started in university covering the story that I ultimately wrote this book about. And it's a story that's complex. It's often changing, but there are many parallels to what we cover around the world. It's a story about humans and people who do things for a reason. And part of my role as a chief correspondent in the Middle East is to tell that story, but make people care about the story, try to humanize the people involved so that other people can understand that this is a story about people, and people are complex and they are hard to understand sometimes, but that's what we do as journalists. We try to get to the core of why people do what they do and to tell these stories in a fair and objective way so that people care about them and that they want to learn more and that they want to be educated on what's happening in the world.
Well, you've mentioned that Walter Cronkite and Edward R. Murrow are role models. How did you learn about them? Because they're not contemporaries of yours, of course. And how have they shaped your career, and how have you shaped your career around their example?
So the location isn't open anymore, but I'll tell people about it. And you might remember if you'd gone to Washington, D.C. when it was called the Newseum. And it was a large museum right on the main drag,
Pennsylvania
Constitution Avenue. Yep. Yeah, Constitution going right into Pennsylvania. And you could go there and you could basically walk around, and there was a helicopter that was suspended from the ceiling. And you could walk through the halls of this museum and learn about the greats that came before this generation of war correspondents, of anchors, of people that were in the news industry for what I believe are the reasons that we should all be in the news industry, to gain the trust of the public and to inform and to educate in a fair and objective way. And so the Murrows and the Cronkites of the industry, they were highlighted in the Newseum as gold standards of journalism, of what we should try to emulate in our coverage. And I saw what they did during the Second World War and into the Vietnam War. And I saw that as something admirable, something that I could look up to and say, why don't we take these values that got people interested in storytelling a long time ago, especially in conflict, something that people have been interested in for hundreds and hundreds of years, and try to take some of those pieces of storytelling and put them into the modern age. And that means trying to meet the audience where they are. It means using things like Instagram and TikTok and Facebook and X to take these reports that we're doing in real time during breaking news stories like the one on October 7th, or the war that we've covered in Ukraine or Syria, for example, where I just returned from, and try to meet this audience online or on TV, wherever they're at consuming the news, but use those ideals, use the trust and use the storytelling that allows people to connect with reporters and with correspondents as those people who go to the places that other people won't go and tell those stories.
Well, I do want to cover social media, which comes up in the book rather interestingly. But before we go there, I do want to address another element of your journalism journey, one that I found particularly fascinating, and it has to do with your grandmother and that the fact that she took you on a trip to Egypt when you were 16 years old. What happened on that trip that set this course for your professional life?
So this was something that from the very beginning of the idea for Black Saturday, I talked with my publisher and talked with my team that I wanted to include this story because it's a very small story, but I think that it represents who I am today. And it's something very personal to me. It's something that I think gets at the core of why I do what I do. When I was 16 years old, I went with my grandmother to Egypt. She had told me when I was a kid that when I got older, she'd take me to Egypt and we'd see the pyramids, we'd go down the Nile. And I wanted to be Indiana Jones when I was a kid. That was my dream job. And a little bit of what I do today, I feel like I get to do that. I go to the places around the world and meet fascinating people in faraway lands. But we were in Egypt, and the year was 2009 in November, and we were on a cruise down the Nile in Aswan, Egypt, and my grandmother had a heart attack and ultimately a stroke. And she survived this ordeal, but as a 16-year-old, I didn't really know what was going on. I didn't know what to do. And so what I did was I journaled and I started to take notes of what was happening, not just on our trip, but during that event that was really traumatic for me personally. And ultimately, I was able to take those notes back with me and tell the stories of what happened in Egypt to my family and to my friends. But it was on this trip that I got interested in journalism. I realized I can go to different places and take notes and take photos and be able to tell stories in a way that captures the attention of the audience, of the people that are listening. And sometimes they're a small personal story like that, or sometimes it's a large today. But ultimately, my grandmother survived the ordeal. She passed away years later, and I buried those notes with her. But I took one of the pages and I brought it back to Egypt and I floated it on the Nile as a symbolic gesture to remember how all of this started. Because really, for me, that was the moment that I said, wow, I can tell stories and connect people to events around the world. And oftentimes those events won't be easy to consume, but they're important to know about.
There's a very powerful picture in the book of you with your grandmother on Easter Island, and the love that you two had for each other comes through, and it's really neat to hear the impact that she had on your life. So thank you for sharing that. So on our journey to October 7th, and you're writing the book, tell us maybe a thumbnail sketch of some of the biggest international stories and hotspots you covered before October 7th.
Yeah, before October 7th, I reported around the world for Fox News. And prior to that, for a company that I founded with my roommate in college called News to Share. And when I was reporting for Fox, I was in places as history was being written. I was on the ground in Afghanistan after the Taliban takeover in 2021. I was in Kyiv, Ukraine, the night the Russians invaded. I reported in Beirut, Lebanon, after the port explosion and the aftermath of that story. So many of these locations that I think have shaped our modern conversation about where foreign policy is headed. And there are these links that are so interesting to look at because they're tied to what we're covering today as we speak. I think back to being in Baghdad after Qasem Soleimani was killed in the American drone strike in 2020. I reported from Pakistan, from the Gulf, all over. But October 7th, in a very unique way, was closer to me because the Middle East was where I started my career as a TV journalist when I was 20 years old. And I took my backpack and my DSLR camera and went into Gaza during the 51-day war in 2014. But it was also the region that I started to build my professional career at Fox. I moved to the Middle East in 2018 as a 24-year-old with an organization that wanted to take a chance on a young reporter. And I think they could see that the passion and desire aligned. I wanted to get out and be in the field and report in real time what was happening in the Middle East. But the lead up to October 7th was quite interesting because it was a story that was in my backyard. I am speaking to you right now, less than an hour away from the Gaza Strip, less than an hour from where we reported on the morning of October 7th. And so I would go into Gaza sometimes just for breakfast to meet with sources in Hamas and Islamic Jihad. Members of the military in Israel I would meet with for coffee in Tel Aviv. The sourcing for this story was unlike any other that I just listed because this is a story that I have lived for the past 6 years of my life.
Well, your book, Black Saturday, reads like a thriller, and tragically, horribly, it's all terribly real. So it's really gripping in that sense. Please walk us through how your day started that October 7th when you got a 7:03 a.m. phone call from your producer when Israel was under attack by Hamas. What was that like? I think you were asleep when the call actually came in, right?
Yeah, I was asleep. And when my producer calls me, it's not totally abnormal because if there's any breaking news, she calls and wakes me up if it's in the middle of the night. But it was her tone that really jolted me awake that morning. It Something was wrong. And I immediately got up and got on the phone with my boss and told him what little information that I had, that Israel was under attack and that there were rockets soaring through the skies of this country. But at that moment, I didn't have the information that you learn about in Black Saturday because I'm just waking up. I'm in Tel Aviv, almost an hour from the border, and everything's very new. Nobody really knows what's going on. They just know that there's an attack being launched from Gaza. But in the past, attacks like this have happened, rocket attacks into Israel, sometimes unexpected. Oftentimes there are triggers like a targeted assassination or a tension at the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound in Jerusalem. But this was different. There was something about this that was different, but our role as journalists doesn't change. We go to where the story is happening. And so on that morning, I called the team. Everyone is prepared to go and meet at the Gaza border. And that's our plan, to meet in the southern city of Sderot, a city of about 30,000 people that sits along the Gaza border that traditionally we have used for reporting. And as I'm coordinating to get the team to the south, rockets start to be fired at Tel Aviv. And I go out on my balcony and start reporting, and interceptions are happening overhead. Some of the rockets are slamming into the sea. But I realize, okay, this is significant. Hamas and Islamic Jihad are firing on Israel's second largest city. But still, at that moment, I have no idea how significant it is.
Well, let's go a little deeper then, and how things unfolded in real time. So you mentioned in the book you get in your Jeep and you drive south. What was the split-second decision you made that you believe saved your life and the lives of your crew later that day? And what went on at that parking lot with your crew?
It's interesting because when things happen in real time, it's sort of like the burnt toast theory. And I don't write about this in the book, but I've thought about it since. This idea that if you burn your toast at the moment, it'd be a frustrating thing and maybe set your day back a few minutes. But in the outcome of life, that could save your life, or it can drastically alter the course of your life. And this is what happened on the morning of October 7th. My team and I decided we would meet at a location in southern Israel where there was some smoke rising from a building that had been hit by a rocket. And it took us some time to find each other. In the chaos of the morning, we were coming from different directions. My cameraman and producer were coming from Jerusalem, and I was driving from Tel Aviv. And there was a delay of 10 or 15 minutes till we actually were able to get together and start reporting at that location that we had planned to meet. And I remember at the time being frustrated, sending another voice note to my producer, asking her, "Where are you? Here's my pin. This is our location. We need to meet here." But looking back, that delay may have saved our lives, because ultimately what happens is we, after this location, work our way closer to the Gaza border. Because again, at this time, we don't know there are thousands of gunmen in southern Israel. There are some reports of infiltrations, a few videos that are circulating around, but there's no confirmation that this is a wide scale ground assault into southern Israel. And so there's this delay. But then there's another decision that we make as we get closer to the border, and we come to an intersection where there are a few officers and some people, but no indication that this is the furthest you can go or any sort of formal roadblock that's in place. But I make a decision at that moment. And this is really, I would say, the defining moment that I, looking back, realized saved our lives. I decide in that moment, we're going to stay put. We're going to stay at this intersection close to the Gaza border. I don't want to push it. And I don't know why. I think about this a lot, but I don't know why, but I made that decision. Ultimately, it was a decision that absolutely saved our lives, because as we would later find out, the next intersection that we would drive to was ambushed by Hamas gunmen. And the distance between the two intersections is less than a minute. And it really gives you a sense of time and how sometimes in these environments that we operate in as war correspondents, the difference of 1 minute can mean life and death. And for many people, unfortunately, as I found out in the course of my reporting for Black Saturday, sometimes people didn't make that decision to stop. They kept going. They thought they were doing the right thing, getting out of harm's way, or driving from a music festival, or trying to leave their house and wanted to keep what's seen these communities along the border. And in some cases, that saved their lives, and in some cases, that cost them their lives.
So Trey, how much of this when it comes to self-preservation is gut versus thinking? What's going on through your mind from a self-preservation standpoint when it comes to staying alive when you're in the thick of things and working to get the story out to the world?
An interesting question. And I think that it's a combination of the two, and it depends on the environment. And so when there's an environment that is very fluid, like the environment on the morning of October 7th, it's almost entirely gut, because you have to work with what is in front of you. And you can train and you can practice and you can run through scenarios as many times as you want. But when it's really intense, when you are in the middle of a breaking news story where there are gunmen in battles in the distance, or even you're on a military embed and there's an ambush that happens, or there's a firefight that's taking place, you have to be able to trust your instincts and say, this doesn't feel right, or I think I need to get to cover. There are times when you go into an environment like a protest, for example, where you can plan and you can say, okay, we know there's going to be a lot of police officers here. We know there are going to be demonstrators here. There may be some clashes. And if those clashes take place, we'll get to the hard cover over here. On the morning of October 7th, we had no time to plan. We only had time to react. And I think in retrospect, it's easy to say our instinct is just so nuanced and we have so much experience that we're able to guide ourselves through this morning and survive because we're just the best in the industry. And while I think we are the best in the industry when it comes to reporting, I think on the instinct front, on a breaking news moment like that on October 7th, a lot of it was timing and luck, because the gunmen could have easily come from the field off to our right that we didn't anticipate. They could have easily surrounded us from the backside. It's just impossible to know in an environment like that.
Switching gears a little bit, you do share in the book how close you are to your dad and how you're in regular contact with him, but he worries about you. And tell us a little bit about that, if you would, and what is your connection to him that helps you in these kinds of chaotic, often dangerous situations?
Yeah, I always call my dad my second agent, because he watches my tape the way that like a father of a quarterback would watch their tape. He looks at the details. He says, you should wear a button-down shirt if you're interviewing a politician, or if you are in the field and you cover something that is a bright moment amid a dark story, you should smile at the end. He watches things and he tries to give me really honest and sincere feedback. And I think that I find it incredibly valuable, but I also, and I write about this in Black Saturday, I worry about how selfish this job is, because I have one priority in these environments, whether it's here in Israel, covering the war that still is unfolding as we speak, or in other parts of the Middle East. I just got back from Syria, where I was reporting on the ground in Damascus after the fall of the Assad regime. And my dad in real time tries not to tell me that he's worried, because he doesn't want to distract me or influence my decision making. But afterwards, you can hear the relief in his voice. And even when we spoke 48 hours ago, when I came out of Syria, he sort of led on. He was really worried. And he didn't mention that while I was on the ground, because he didn't want to distract me and he didn't want me to be worried about what he was thinking about. And so it's a complex and really special relationship for me. He's someone who watches all of my reports and is really deeply involved in my professional career, and always has been, even before I became a network correspondent, working at a cable news network that is number one in the country. He was supporting me when I was putting videos on my YouTube channel and getting 10 and 15 views, and going to Ukraine, for example, in 2014 and trying to sell raw video and no one was buying it. He has always been a massive supporter of my work. And it's interesting now to be operating at this level, because I think that our relationship in many ways hasn't changed. He still wants me to be safe, and he wants me to practice the craft in the way that he knows that I do. and that is in a really old school fashion, in a way that is based on journalism ethics and relationships and sourcing. And it's great to have someone in my life that reminds me of those things every day, because it's it's a really, I think it's a competitive industry in many ways. It's a high stress industry, and to have someone in my corner all the time, like my father, it's just something that means a lot to me.
Well, thank you for sharing that. It's obviously a very special relationship that you have with him. He doesn't have a journalism background, does he, or did he?
No, he doesn't. He built houses. He's retired now, but he always liked the news, and he was someone who still watches the news, and not just Fox. He'll tell me, "Hey, did you see this piece that David Muir did overnight?" Or he'll say, "Look at this package that they aired in prime time on CNN. See how they did the end there." He's a connoisseur of news, and that's really cool too, because it's something that I love to talk about. I like talking shop. It's All my friends are journalists. Everything that I do is about this industry, and I live and breathe the news. And so it's cool to have him so invested in the work that I do.
In Black Saturday, you write the accounts of some amazing people who you interviewed after the attack. Is there perhaps one in particular that comes to mind? One that struck me was Police Corporal Molly Shashana, who went to work at a police station on October 7th. She's a single mom. She's providing for her family. She's picking up shifts to help provide more for her family. Maybe a word about her experience at the police station during the Hamas attack, or any other individual stories that are reflective of the broader situation you encountered.
Yeah, Molly Shoshana, I think, is a great example of someone who wanted to survive so that she could continue to be a mother. Um, you think about any parent in these situations, Israelis, Palestinians, anyone in war. And so often they are motivated by their loved ones in the way that you and I are. We want to make sure that our families are provided for, and that they're safe, and that they can go to bed at night and not have to worry about if they'll survive or not. And I find that there are so many similar threads in the stories that we cover. So Molly's story, I think, is a really representative example of that. I think about Raed Mosa, a doctor in Gaza who was doing everything possible to just keep his family safe. And I thought he was a great representative example of so many Palestinians that I meet who are trying to survive amid war. And then I think Gil Shamir stands out to me, the brother of our engineer at Fox, who survived a Hamas attack on his house in the kibbutz, the small community of Nir Oz, but just barely. And we returned to his house that is now just rubble and charred remains. And I think, and I'll go into the weeds here of my reporting, because I think that you understand this in a way that I think gets to the core of how I understand these stories. Oftentimes you watch the package on TV, or you hear the interview, or you read about the interview in Black Saturday. The way that I tend to gauge people's experiences, I look into their eyes. And oftentimes people have seen things that are so unimaginable, and they've lived through such trauma. And when you see them recalling these experiences, their eyes tell a story that I try to capture in the course of our reporting. But I just remember Gil's eyes when we returned to his house in Nir Oz, and he was replaying what happened. And he and his wife survived, but so many people in their community were slaughtered, and so many people in their community were kidnapped and taken hostage into the Gaza Strip, where some of them remain today. And there's a sadness about people's eyes in these environments. And I see it in Israel, I see it in Gaza, I see it in Syria, all over. And I think that when we talk about these humans, if anything, and this is a little off track to your initial question, but if people can take away anything from the course of our reporting and the course of our writing, it's that the people involved are not characters in a movie. They're humans, and they're people who maybe sometimes as a reader or a viewer, you may disagree with their position, or you feel that their experience is one piece of a broader puzzle. But it's to remember that they have feelings and emotions, and they feel fear. And just because they lived through an experience doesn't mean that they forget about it. And so I would say that Gil's story is one that really stands out to me.
And is it fair to say that you're telling a broader story through these individual accounts and stories?
Yeah, absolutely. And that was part of the the effort that I wanted to make with this book and writing a book in real time as we continued our coverage of a war that is still happening as we speak was to find people who could represent others, because oftentimes these stories can feel quite overwhelming. You think about the 9 million plus Israelis who have experienced rocket fires and missile fires recently as last night when sirens were sounding here in Tel Aviv. And you think about the Palestinians who have survived a bombing campaign that oftentimes has killed civilians and displaced nearly the entirety of the Gaza Strip. There are no winners in war. And it sounds cliche, but the civilian population really does pay the highest price amid these conflicts. And so if I can find people who humanize the conflict in a way that makes viewers at home or readers or listeners just stop and think for a moment, hey, that kind of sounds like my brother, or hey, I've got kids and I could imagine how that would feel if my kids were under threat. I think I've done my job as a journalist and as an author. And so that's what I try to do, is find characters who represent larger populations of people.
Well, let's zoom out a little bit. The Israel-Gaza border was regarded as one of the most advanced in the world, but notwithstanding that, Hamas terrorists infiltrated it. They also overran Israeli military bases near the border. From your perspective, and with the benefit of some time passing and the ability to further reflect, how and why did that all happen? How did it fail so spectacularly? And I realize there'll be inquiries and so on, but what's your quick take on that, Trey?
My quick take is that the Israelis got complacent and in some cases lazy. And when you say that to the Israeli people, actually most agree with that criticism of their military and government. And we knew that this wall and these sensors and the remote machine guns and all of the advanced equipment along the border was some of the most advanced in the world. We'd seen it up close. We'd done stories on it. And to see it fail was one thing. I think the most significant failure of the Israeli military was the intelligence branch.
Yeah.
The Israelis are known for having extensive pieces of intelligence, both live and stagnant intelligence inside Gaza. And this was missed. The mobilization of thousands of gunmen was missed. The SIM cards that were switched on to make sure that these fighters had comms in southern Israel, it was missed. And so you had all of these things go wrong. And it was truly a series of misfortunes for the Israelis, because not only did the intelligence failure happen, then the border wall failed. The bases that were supposed to act as the first line of defense were overrun. And then the response time was not coordinated in a way that you would expect a country like Israel, a country filled with military operators, to be.
You recount that in the book, essentially people self-activating, but also waiting for orders, and they're not getting them. It's not what one would imagine.
Yeah, and I speak with a friend of mine who was in Miluim, the reserve forces, and he responds that day, Itai. And Itai shows up to a base, and he's not with his Sevet, his team. And basically, soldiers are getting what weapons they have there, and they're being just sort of grouped into whoever's around to head toward the border. And these were very localized incidents. This was not a coordinated response from the top of the military. And look, I think it's something that the Israelis and the rest of the world will continue to study for decades to come, because it's unimaginable that a failure at this level would happen to a country like Israel with such an advanced military. What's even more unimaginable is when you think about the coordination that Hamas had to have in order to conduct an attack on this scale and to take 250 hostages and to slaughter around 1,200 people. I mean, the coordination had to be extensive. And what's interesting is we know it was extensive. We saw the videos coming out. They had these training camps inside Gaza. And I can remember online seeing these Hamas militants storming into buildings that looked like the buildings we saw in the kibbutzim. And they would practice taking hostages. And people would see this and they would be like, oh, that's just Hamas training. That's their military wing training. They could never actually do this. And then they did. And it has changed the entire course of the world, because the Middle East has now shifted as a result. There have been just massive changes that if you and I spoke 15 months ago, it would have been hard to wrap your mind around. If you told me 15 months ago that Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas, that Ismail Haniyeh, the other leader of Hamas, that Mohammed Def, the entire top tier of this Iran-backed group would be wiped out, I would have told you it's impossible. If you would have told me that Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, a group that 15 months ago was believed to have an arsenal of around 150,000 missiles and rockets, would be nearly destroyed in terms of their military capabilities to threaten Israel, it would have been hard to continue the conversation because there would be so many questions of, well, wouldn't they have rained down these missiles on Israeli cities, and wouldn't they have infiltrated into northern Israel? The region has changed so much, not to mention the ongoing tension between Israel and Iran, the fact that the Israelis are now striking Iranian territory, the fact the Iranians have launched missiles into Israel, the fact that the Assad regime has fallen because it no longer has the support of Iran-backed Hezbollah and neighboring Lebanon. So October 7th changed the course of history, and people will continue to study what went wrong on that day, and they'll also try to understand how this started a domino effect across the region and whether or not the end result will be something that can mean more stability in the Middle East or less.
I'm going to invite you to speculate. In the book, you point out Israeli fear of an attack from the north as the attack in Gaza unfolded. Why do you think there wasn't a Hezbollah attack from the north right away? Do you have any gut sense, or do you care to speculate on that?
Yeah, I think we can look at recent history, and I think to give you a clear answer in the course of this conversation, and we'll go a lot deeper when we meet in person on this particular topic, because I'm really interested in it. But to give you just one answer, it's because Hassan Nasrallah, the man who was killed earlier this year in an Israeli airstrike in the Lebanese capital of Beirut, he also was the leader in charge in 2006 during the Second Lebanon War. And he infamously said afterwards he would have never went to war with Israel had he known the destruction that would be brought to the Lebanese people. And he had a long memory. He had spent his entire existence fighting Israel. And so he knew that if he got involved in a direct conflict, that it risked his life, and it also risked his organization and their control over southern Lebanon and pockets of southern Beirut. The miscalculation, and again, this is speculation, but it's more analysis than it is speculation. The miscalculation that Nasrallah made was that Israel would see a war of attrition as different than an immediate attack on October 8th. Hezbollah got involved in the fight on October 8th, but they didn't start raining down thousands of rockets and missiles on Israeli cities. They had the capability. They opted for a war of attrition that ultimately displaced anywhere from 70,000 to 100,000 Israelis. And Israeli leadership saw that as just as bad. And ultimately, they made a decision to kill not only Nasrallah, but nearly the entire leadership of this Iran-backed group.
Let's switch gears again. You write in Black Saturday about being, quote, calm amid the storm when you're reporting. The word focus comes to your mind often. How do you balance your reporting with processing all the horror that you witness in real time? I imagine it must take a real emotional toll. How do you do that?
It's challenging. And I think that when I was younger, I thought that when I got older, it would be easier. But it's actually gotten harder. And this is something I've actually never spoken about publicly in the course of this reporting, but it's something that I'm dealing with as we speak right now, just coming back from Syria and trying to reintegrate into what I would consider normal life. Today's Thursday. This time last week, we were in Syria and reporting on the aftermath of the prison system that the Assad regime left behind and the torture victims. And, we saw the bodies of the civilians who were tortured under the Assad regime. And now this week, tonight, Thursday night, I'll probably go out to dinner with my friends in Tel Aviv. And, maybe we'll go for a walk near the beach after. And just the difference in life experience 1 week can make in the course of my job, it's challenging. It's really challenging. And as I've gotten older, it has gotten harder. And I thought it was going to get easier. And I think it's gotten harder because as you get older, you start to, I think, value life even more. You realize it's finite, and you realize that the most important thing is to have in life, or it's not the money and the fame, but it's the people around you and your loved ones and your friends and family. And I think you can empathize more with the people that we interview. And that goes for any story that we cover. And so, as it relates to October 7th and the war, the first, I would say, 6 months of the war, I was really nonstop. I was reporting around the clock. I started to write Black Saturday. Even now, I feel like I haven't totally disconnected from the story. And I think some of that is situational. You know, last night, just for example, I was up late and was sort of disconnecting or trying to reintegrate. And then sirens were sounding across Tel Aviv, and it was a quick reminder, okay, the war's still going on. I still need to be vigilant. There are missiles raining down on Israel. And so I feel like I actually still haven't had time to process the attack and what we saw in the aftermath of the attack, which is interesting because it's been almost 500 days now. And I think one day I do hope to have like maybe a month to just go sit in silence and think about it. But it's tough because the next story happens. And when you think you have time to process things, another big story comes up and you need to respond. And look, I signed up for this. I love this job. And if I were to ask my bosses, hey, can I take those weeks off to do that? They would say, absolutely. I mean, the nonstop work is self-imposed, but it's because I love it. And it's because I feel a purpose. And it's because this is my identity for good or bad. And so it does take a personal toll, and it's something that I write about in Black Saturday. It's challenging, but I do think that because I feel such a purpose in the work that we do, I'm able to, I think, rationalize it in my head.
Thank you for sharing that. That's certainly very powerful, and I imagine that you and other journalists really on that cutting edge experience, whether it's formally PTSD or something like it, real psychological impacts as you admittedly do something you love, but it comes at a high cost.
Yeah, absolutely.
More broadly, and you do cover some of this in Black Saturday, and it has to do with empathy for the families of the loved ones about whom you're reporting, how you respect the dignity of those who are killed or taken hostage. Can you walk us through how do you make those decisions? How do you approach that in real time and often very chaotic situations? How does that empathy work, Trey?
I think it goes back to what you and I spoke about earlier, and this concept of gut decisions versus planned decisions. And I think that the majority of those decisions are made with the gut. And I think to myself in real time, how would I feel in this situation? How can I constantly humanize the people involved? And that was challenging on the morning of October 7th and in the days after, because we saw so many horrific things. I mean, there were communities that we went into, and you couldn't tell who was a resident of the community and who was a dead gunman. There were just bodies everywhere. And there were moments, and there was a moment outside the Sderot police station that I write about, where I just had to make a decision in real time. And the additional challenge for me is that oftentimes these decisions are made while I'm live on TV in front of an audience of millions. And so the pressure is even higher. But I actually feel that I operate better under pressure. I don't know why, but I feel that the decision-making process for me is easier under pressure because I feel that I have to be more decisive. You can't dilly-dally when you're live on TV and there's a very serious issue at hand. If you are going to make a decision to show something, you need to make sure that you give the audience a warning first. If you are going to explain that you can't show something, you need to explain why you're not showing that, because you also want to make sure that you're transparent with the audience and clear in your reporting. But I think it all comes back to empathy. It comes back to trying to put yourself in the shoes of a family member of both Israelis and Palestinians. I would say the majority of people that I encounter in war are the bystanders of conflict. They didn't start the war and they don't want to be there. That's the majority of the people that I cover. And I think that the people who make the most headlines are the minority who are fighting the war. And that's hard.
We talked about Edward R. Murrow and Walter Cronkite earlier. One tool that was not available to them in their era was social media. And in the book, you talk about the role of social media and how it plays out in your coverage. You recount how you're reading, what you're reading online. Can you walk us through what role does X play, your social media feed more generally? How does that shape your reporting, your sense of what's going on?
It's interesting. I think of social media as secondary to my reporting for TV, but I think that it can complement my reporting on TV. There are often times where there are updates that don't make sense for a live report, maybe something small that adds color to the story. I think there are times where a photo is taken that is of value to an audience, but maybe not of much value to a TV audience that is consuming video most of the time. And then I think more broadly, it's an opportunity to connect with a younger audience that isn't traditionally watching cable television. We know that the average age of a cable news viewer is far older than the average age of someone on X or on TikTok or on Instagram. And so part of my goal with using social media is to get this younger audience interested in the stories that we're telling. And whether they know it or not, and I talk about it publicly, so if they're listening, they'll know it. They're being told stories in the way that Cronkite and Murrow told stories, in a way that tries to take the audience to the location, and in a way that a correspondent is not used as a celebrity to be a focal point of an actor in a movie, for example, but rather to be a voice of honesty and truth, so that someone can say to themselves subconsciously, when they see a video pop up on social media from someone like myself, they can think to themselves very quickly, okay, I trust this person. Whatever they're going to say is true. And that's really important because you only get one reputation. And as we have seen in recent days, even, the internet is a place that things will spread like wildfire. And so it's critical to be putting out accurate and clear information. But again, I find it to be an opportunity to A, connect with that younger audience and try to drive traffic back to our main platform, which is the Fox News channel. And B, to be able to connect with an audience in a more personal way than I can on television. Sometimes TV feels very sterile to me. And I try not to make my reports sterile. I try to tell stories in a way that makes people feel emotion and makes people connect to the subjects that I'm interviewing. But still, when you're in front of a camera and the lights are there and there's a big setup and you have 2 minutes or 3 minutes to report, or sometimes 20 minutes, it depends on the moment, and then you're done and they move on to the next story, that can feel very sterile. And so what I try to do in social media is make people feel a little closer to the story and give them a little bit of color that maybe they're not getting on TV, with the same end goal that we talked about at the very beginning, and that's to make people care. I want people to care about these stories. I don't want them to fly here and get on the ground and start participating or helping or volunteering. I just want them to talk about what's happening, and I want them to start a conversation. And ideally, that will be a conversation that is productive and objective, and a conversation that is filled with empathy, that says, wait, maybe this isn't black and white. Maybe this isn't so clear cut. Maybe there are good people on both sides of this conflict, and we should listen to their voices to try to understand why they believe what they believe and how they're influenced by other people in their community or in the place that they live that maybe don't have as good of intentions as they have.
Well, let's go a little bit deeper on some of these points. So you make the point in Black Saturday that you're not here to take sides or to make people look good or to look bad. You're here to tell a story. So in your journey of conveying the truth, how do you source the facts and make sure your reporting is accurate, especially with pervasive disinformation and inaccuracies online? How do you make sure, as best you can, especially in the chaotic environment in which you're often working, that you're assembling and conveying the truth?
I think the main thing is to be patient. I think that the truth ultimately comes out in the end. And I think that being patient is really critical, because we're often flooded with information. And I would say the majority of the information that we get initially is not always inaccurate, but doesn't tell the whole story. And so it's to be patient, to understand that all of these stories are a puzzle and you have to put the pieces together. They're not a single piece. And then I think finally and again, I think this is the skill that is not taught in journalism school, but it is the skill that is attributed to all the best correspondents I know, is to have that gut instinct to, if something feels off, to ask questions and to probe and to hold those in power accountable for what they say and what they do, and not just accept a press release, not just accept a position or a statement, but to remember our role as journalists. Our role as journalists, it's to hold those in power accountable for their actions. It's to truly act as the fourth estate, to be able to be a voice of reason and truth amid oftentimes the fog of war and competing narratives that are constantly, especially in the age of social media and the digital age, trying to spin an audience one way or another. And I think that you can do that, and you can be that tough journalist and still be empathetic and still hold values that are based on reports that are humans first. And really it's a brand thing for me. I mean, it's critical that all of our reports are focusing on the subjects and are focusing on humans, not on one side or another, not on Israelis or Palestinians, but on the reality of the situation on the ground. And I think the best way to tell that reality is through the voices of others, not through my voice.
I do want to talk about Syria in a moment, but before we address that, are there stories that you know personally, whether in the Middle East or beyond, that are important but not yet getting the attention or coverage that they deserve?
Absolutely. I think Sudan is a story that is not getting enough coverage. I think the humanitarian crisis in Yemen is not getting enough coverage. I think that in a really unfortunate way, the way that the media operates is shifting from one major story to another. And I think that's another positive thing about social media, is that we can continue to cover maybe underreported stories in ways that maybe aren't going to make headlines in the United States, but still can have space online. But yeah, I think Sudan, I think Yemen, I think Syria, even after this week, will need to be covered for years to come. I think we've only scratched the surface of the stories there. But Syria is a great example. I mean, we just saw on the ground the aftermath of the Assad regime and what was left behind. Those stories and those experiences were happening just a few weeks ago to people, and we weren't covering it as much as we could have, and no one was, because we were here in the Middle East, or I was a week before that in Ukraine interviewing President Zelensky. And I think that speaks to a personal problem that I feel that I have as a human in this industry, and it's that I can't be in multiple places at once, and it's a frustration that I have. And I try to jump around as much as I can, and to cover as many stories as I can, but it's tough because I'm on the ground in Ukraine, and Ukraine's a place that I spent more than 200 days reporting since the Russian invasion started. I've reported all over Ukraine. I interviewed President Zelensky 2 separate times since the war began in sit-down interviews. I just returned from the Eastern front lines with him last month. And, I go to Ukraine and I speak with the civilian population there, who is still immensely suffering daily attacks by the Russians, and they're losing territory in the East. And I tell as many of those stories as I can, and I sit down with the president, and well, then I'm off to another story. And after that, I was in South Korea, and I was reporting on a really important story in South Korea. And then right after South Korea, I got back and I was here for less than 48 hours, and then I was off to Syria. And so sometimes it feels like I don't have enough time to get to these stories, and that can be really frustrating. And I think that when we talk about stories that are underreported, I have a laundry list of stories, and I'm constantly writing notes to myself. Okay, let's find a way to just touch on this story so that we bring it to people's attention, but it's never enough.
What's your sense of the audience's appetite for these kinds of powerful international stories? In some quarters, the perspective is, oh, it's not in the United States, therefore people don't really care as much. Is that your experience? I mean, obviously you're putting so much out there, not only on TV, but on social media. What's your sense of maybe people in your age bracket and so on? What's their sense or appetite for international stories of this type?
I think that's a valid point. I think that traditionally, and just maybe based on human nature, people are most interested in what's happening in their neighborhood. I think that's why local news still exists, because people want to know what's happening in their town or in their area of a state. But I think there is still an appetite for international news. I think that people are fascinated by how other humans live. And I think that when stories are told in a way that connects what's happening here in the Middle East or anywhere in the world with the humans who are watching in the United States, I think that appetite increases. And it's a valid point that people are most interested in what's happening close to them. But I think there is still an appetite for what's happening around the world. But it comes down to how these stories are being told. And sometimes you have to meet an audience on TikTok. And to get a 16 to 24-year-old in the United States to be interested on what's happening on the ground in the Middle East, maybe you have to meet them with a selfie style video to say, hey, this is what's going on. And then the idea is that not all of them are going to be interested and want to go deeper, but if some of them are, then maybe they'll watch the in-depth report that I did that's 3 or 4 minutes long. And then maybe they'll follow me and know when I'm coming on TV to hear what's happening during the latest development with a ceasefire deal that's likely to happen in the next week. And so I think the appetite is there, but it depends on how present and mindful the storytellers can be, and understanding that while I may find something incredibly interesting and I would love to read a 5,000 word deep dive on the Assad regime prison system, well, that's because I'm a war correspondent in the Middle East. Maybe someone who's sitting at home in my hometown of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, isn't as interested. Okay, well, what would they be interested in? There are things that they would be interested in. We've got to identify those as journalists and try to connect them. And sometimes they're not as specific as a topic like a prison system or a country or a foreign leader. But I find actually that the most successful way to connect people is through the things that we have in common. Can I find a mother whose son has been missing, who wants him to come home for dinner? That's something that maybe someone in Pennsylvania will be able to connect to.
You mentioned you were just in Syria. Look, given the momentous collapse of the regime there, what's your latest sense of the situation on the ground? And can the emerging power structure move away from its terrorist past and gain credibility?
I'll start with the second question. I think the short answer is yes. I think it's possible, but it's not certain. And I think it's possible based on 2 things. I think that the new leader, Jolani, is cognizant of what it takes to be a leader in the Middle East and to engage with the international community. And at least early on, and again, this could change very rapidly, but early on, he is signaling that he wants Syria to be a place that is stable and a place that he is able to stay in control of, which makes sense from a standpoint of any leader. They want to stay in power. But also he understands that Syria was quite isolated under the Assad regime. It was under heavy economic international sanctions. And it was a place that people couldn't visit because they thought it was too dangerous, that they would be kidnapped. And you see all of these diplomats that are now going to Damascus. They are meeting with Jolani. They are talking to HTS leadership about reopening embassies. And so I think there's hope to have a Syria that is more stable, that gets rid of some level of corruption. I don't think all corruption. I just think based on it would take a massive overhaul that I don't think is possible in the short term, but something to look toward. But the short answer to your second question is yes. I think it is possible for HTS, an organization that built itself on some of the most extreme factions in Syria, the al-Nusra Front, in some cases ISIS, to be able to put that past aside, but they will have to be very thoughtful about it. They will have to basically have all of the militants put their weapons down and form an army that is at least claiming to be following international law, and then start to engage with countries around the world and be open to transparency and to accountability. It's yet to be seen if that will happen, but there are signals that it could. As to the first question, I think the most important signal that I saw as a Middle East correspondent was that no one from the leadership that I met with in Damascus to the fighters on the ground, some of them that were wearing patches of the Islamic State, had any interest in going to war with Israel. And I asked them why. And I thought this was something I was surprised about. And I said, well, why? I mean, everyone in the Middle East has some level of, from frustration to active war with Israel. Why would your new government be any different? And they said, we want to control Syria. We want to be in charge of Syria. We've been at war for more than 12 years. Why would we want to go to another war? And I think it's an opportunity. And maybe this is the optimist in me, the humanitarian in me, But I think it's an opportunity, not for Syria and Israel to have an open relationship with trade and tourism, but to have a neutral relationship. Maybe a relationship like the Israelis and the Egyptians have, where there is some level of security cooperation, but there isn't a friendly banter that involves trade and open tourism. But there are opportunities for working together to not be at war and to at least having deconfliction lines. And so I think it's a possibility, but the reality of the future of Syria is still yet to be written.
How do you see great power competition playing out in Syria and the region, given the latest developments, particularly with respect to Russia, but potentially China as well, and the broader implications for Iran and its malign influence?
I think that the collapse of the Assad regime was a massive blow to the Russians and the Iranians in Syria. They'll no longer have the ability to operate freely and have bases, at least to the extent that they had before. And that's going to do a couple different things. And I try to answer these questions on a bit of a macro level because I'm so focused day to day on the micro level. But on a short-term basis, it's going to help Israel because Iran will no longer be able to smuggle weapons through Syria, which was their main supply route to support Hezbollah. So they won't be able to rearm Hezbollah. They're going to have to rely on domestic production, which is a fraction of what they had in their arsenal before this war began. In terms of Russia, it poses a massive question about what Russia does next. I think that one short term, and again, not to get too micro level on these things, but one short term thing that happens is I think the Russians double down on their efforts in Northern Africa as a continent, because they no longer are going to have this launch point in Syria to be able to freely not only use naval ports, but also places where they had fighter jets taking off from in the central part of Syria. I think there are a number of individual items to look at of what comes next for the Middle East. As for the broader power struggle, I think the biggest open-ended question, and we'll start micro and we'll go macro, is if the Israelis use this opportunity of not having Iranian air defense or Syrian air defense active on a main path to Iran to be able to increase their strikes against Iranian facilities, specifically the country's nuclear facilities. That is a conversation that's taking place in the Middle East right now with a new administration coming in. President-elect Trump has made very clear that he will be very supportive of Israeli actions in the Middle East. The Israelis are very aware of that. And Israel's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, built his political career around being tough against Iran. And given the fact that Hamas and Islamic Jihad are not destroyed, but severely weakened inside Gaza and weakened in the West Bank, Hezbollah is severely weakened in Lebanon, and the Houthis will be increasingly weakened in Yemen. The next major threat for Israel is Iran, a country that has now been in direct conflict with Israel. And so the question is whether or not they will use this path for jets to be able to take off from Israel across Syria over Iraq and strike Iranian territory.
So we have a few minutes remaining, Trey, so I have a couple questions, which will sort of a lightning round here. You mentioned President-elect Trump. He spoke with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and he reiterated his thoughts that all hell is going to break out, those are his words, if Hamas doesn't release hostages by January 20th. What is your assessment of the impacts of his words in the region?
I don't want to speculate too much on the actions that he might take because I have often been surprised. And I was surprised as we were reporting in Amman in 2020 when we learned that Qasem Soleimani was killed in a U.S. drone strike. I've been surprised in multiple administrations as to what actions presidents will take in the Middle East. But I would say that Hamas understands that a new American administration means that there will be a change in Israeli policy. The Israelis don't operate totally independently of the Americans because they rely on money and weapons to conduct activity across the Middle East. And so Hamas understands that. And that's certainly part of their calculation. But also part of their calculation is ending the war that's been ongoing now for 15 months, and a war that has entered the attrition phase. It continues with Israeli forces inside Gaza, and they're looking for an end. And so they will probably try to engage diplomatically, understanding that there will be fresh talks with some new players involved. But then they will have to sort of wait and see what these, you could call them threats, or what they ultimately mean. Are the Americans willing to more actively participate in the conflict to get hostages out of Gaza? Are they just going to support the Israelis and allow them to strike Gaza more indiscriminately? Will they provide more weapons? It's sort of up in the air, and we don't have a whole lot of information on what President-elect Trump's words will actually mean at a policy level.
What's your sense of the way forward with the hostages specifically and any ceasefire agreement? Do you have any analysis on that?
My sense that is that around half of the remaining 101 hostages are no longer alive. I think that complicates the process of negotiation. The Israelis want to get everyone out in this next deal, if there is a deal. The path forward ultimately will likely look like something like we could estimate maybe a 60-day ceasefire. That's what the reports are right now. And you would see maybe not all of the hostages released, but a large number of them released for some high-level Palestinian prisoners. And then international players like Qatar and Egypt would use that lull in fighting to try and stabilize the situation toward a more permanent agreement. And so that's the immediate path forward. And then there are massive questions about reconstruction of Gaza and leadership in Gaza and who's going to be in charge afterwards. And those questions will remain, I think, open-ended.
You're clearly a student of history. We mentioned Walter Cronkite and Edward R. Murrow earlier. I'm speaking to you from Ronald Reagan's office at the Reagan Library here in Simi Valley, California. With an eye towards President Reagan, what does he mean to you?
What does President Reagan mean to me? I think he represents a time in American history where the country was more united. And I think there are certainly times when Americans have disagreed over the course of our country's history on both domestic and foreign policy. But there's an opportunity, I think, always when there's a new administration coming in to look to former administrations in the way that leaders like President Reagan led. And I actually think that he represents a time where America was more united. And my hope is that people will look back in history and they will say that there are opportunities for us to disagree respectfully and still be united as a country, because we live in a really dangerous world, as I have seen firsthand. We live in times where people often lack empathy, and they lack empathy and stability. And so I think that people can look to what he represented in terms of unity for the United States and also stability for the United States, and try to look forward and see if there are some ideals there that can be carried into a new administration.
One of those ideals, of course, was peace through strength. Is that something that you sense resonates where you are or more broadly?
Absolutely. And I think that President Reagan understood how dangerous the world is. And it's always been dangerous. The world has always been at war. And the United States has always played an important role in its history in stabilizing conflicts, sometimes in participating in conflicts that have led to outcomes that create instability in countries. But I think that the idea of peace through strength is something that the Israelis resonate with. That's how they are conducting their war in the Middle East. But it's also how most players in the Middle East operate. And they see it as the only way forward, because they look at it as the way when you're on an airplane and you're told if an oxygen mask drops down that you need to help yourself first and then help the person sitting next to you. And I think that was America under President Reagan. And I think that the Middle East understands that moving forward. They understand that there is value in peace through strength. But I think the thing that I always look back to as an individual is, can that happen with a focus on empathy and a focus on humans, ensuring that nations can be strong, that the United States can be strong, and that we can still be a nation that is giving and loving, because I think those also represent the American values that I hold true.
Trey, as we conclude, is there anything else on your mind or that you'd like to share about your book or your reporting?
I would just say it's an honor to speak here today. I think that when we have these conversations that are more in depth, they humanize the reporting And I'm just really appreciative of everyone who has read Black Saturday, who's interested in our work. And I just want to say thank you to you and the entire team for your interest in our coverage in the Middle East. I think that it is critical that we have these conversations and that we dive deeper into the headlines to get to the heart of the stories.
Well, Trey, thanks to you, your colleagues at Fox, for what you do every day. It's really tremendous work. Black Saturday is a remarkable book. It's riveting. I encourage everybody in our audience to go out and buy it and read it. It's available at reaganfoundation.org/store, reaganfoundation.org/store, or anywhere else you buy books. But a really fascinating and very substantive and thoughtful book. So, Trey, thank you again. We hope to see you here in Simi Valley or in Washington, D.C. at some point soon, and we wish you well. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us for today's virtual programming event. We hope this conversation has inspired you to share what you've learned with your family and friends, and that you'll join us again for an upcoming event.
And let me offer lesson number 1 about America. All great change in America begins at the dinner table. So tomorrow night in the kitchen, I hope the talking begins. And children, if your parents haven't been teaching you what it means to be an American, let them know and nail them on it. That would be a very American thing to do.